They did not come to conquer. They did not come to study or to trade or to warn. The Cashin Tribunal vessel recorded consensus entered orbit with a single stated purpose, transmitted in the flat, complete sentences of a species that had never once lost an argument. Humanity was being formally evaluated for continued sovereign status, and a verdict would be rendered within the week. No warships, no boarding parties, just a courtroom folded into the hull of a ship shaped like a closed book, and 17 Cashin jurists who had already decided before landing that the outcome was a formality. The insult was not in what they threatened. It was in what they assumed. The docket transmitted to the United Nations was titled, in the Cashin's own bureaucratic dialect, Species Deficiency Review Preliminary Finding, Non-Compliant. Attached was a 400-page indictment citing humanity's wars, its pollution, its inconsistent treaties, each entry stamped with a small circular seal that translated roughly to self-evident. Consul Auditor Threl Vantik addressed the General Assembly in person, in perfect, unaccented English, standing with his hands folded behind his back the way a teacher stands before a class he has already graded. "We do not enjoy this," he said, "but a species that cannot govern itself cannot be permitted to govern a solar system. You will be given the opportunity to respond. We do not expect it will change the outcome." Beneath the seal in smaller script was a line that took the UN's translation office 9 hours to render correctly, because the Cashin legal dialect buried its cruelty in subordinate clauses. It read, once properly translated, "This finding requires no response from the subject species. Response protocols exist as a courtesy extended to species capable of participating in their own review." The implication was not subtle once it was visible. The tribunal had not left room for an answer. It had left room for silence and expected to receive it. The chamber was silent for 11 seconds. Then Dr. Amara Voss, seated in the observer section as an invited legal historian and not by any formal measure a diplomat, raised her hand and asked a single question. "Under what authorities?" Vantik smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has asked a clever but ultimately irrelevant question. "Under Cashin judicial precedent dating back 11,000 years. It is older than your written language." "Then you brought your case law with you," Voss said. "That's not a verdict, that's evidence." It was not a rallying cry. It was quieter than that, and it took the room a moment to understand why it mattered. Because a tribunal that cites precedent is a tribunal that can be bound by it. And a species arrogant enough to bring 11,000 years of its own rulings into evidence had also, without meaning to, brought its own rules. Voss had spent 19 years arguing, mostly to empty conference rooms, that no legal system survives contact with its own archive. She had written the paper twice and had it rejected twice, on the grounds that comparative law between human and hypothetical non-human jurisprudence was, in the words of one reviewer, not a serious field of inquiry. She kept both rejection letters. She did not need to explain this history to Anand or Korteng later. They already knew it because the field the reviewers had dismissed was the only one in the building that afternoon that anyone needed. Within 6 hours, Voss had pulled together 3 others to work the case alongside her. Each of them people who had spent careers being told their specialties were irrelevant to anything that mattered. Priya Anand, a comparative linguist who had spent 11 years arguing that legal language could be reverse-engineered like any other structured system, and had been quietly removed from 2 university committees for insisting on it. She kept the removal letters framed in her office, captioned evidence. Dr. Elias Korteng, a procedural theorist whose entire academic career had been built on a single, widely mocked claim, that any system of law complex enough to be enforced was complex enough to contain contradictions that could be found and used. Nobody had taken the claim seriously because nobody had ever handed him a legal system to test it on. Now someone had. His original paper's title, On the Necessary Incompleteness of Enforced Legal Systems, had been rejected 4 times for being, in one reviewer's words, unfalsifiable in any legal system that actually exists. He had kept that review too. And Priya's colleague from the Archive Division, Officer Renata Solis, who had been assigned only to catalog the indictment as it was translated, page by page. Nobody had asked her to read it. She read it twice anyway, because it was easier to log a page correctly if she understood it. And stopping at a summary when the full text sat in front of her had never once occurred to her as an option. Her badge, issued in a hurry, misspelled her surname as Solisset, and she refused on principle to have it corrected before the tribunal ended. The discovery began in the indictment's footnotes, which nobody had read because the footnotes were formatted to be unreadable, dense with Cashin statutory citations meant to overwhelm rather than inform. They worked out of a converted records annex 2 floors below the General Assembly chamber, a room with folding tables and a single overworked router. because nobody had authorized a budget for a case nobody expected to win. Kwarteng had brought his own monitor from home, an old one, because the requisition for a new one had not yet cleared. He set it up in the corner and began cross-referencing the indictment's footnote citations against the fragment of Cashin's statutory code the UN Science Office had managed to extract from the tribunal's public filings. Kwarteng found it first. He stopped scrolling and sat back from the console because his hands had started shaking slightly and he did not trust them near the keyboard. The Cashin tribunal system required, under its own 11,000-year precedent, that any species under review be granted access to the full precedent archive being used to judge them. Not a summary, the full archive. Every ruling, every case unredacted. They have to give it to us, Kwarteng said, because their own law says a verdict without full disclosure is not a verdict, it's an opinion. The team drafted the formal request for the archive that same night, built on Kwarteng's finding and sent it before dawn. It was still awaiting a response when Annen's discovery came, 2 days later, inside the translation itself. The Cashin legal dialect used a grammatical structure that marked every ruling with a tense, indicating whether the judgment was final or provisional. A distinction invisible in the English translation the tribunal had provided. Every Cashin verdict transmitted to Earth so far had been rendered in the provisional tense. Not because the tribunal was being generous. Because under their own procedure, a first ruling against a newly contacted species was never final. It existed to be appealed. They've been telling us this was over, Annen said. Their own grammar says it isn't. She had spent 3 straight nights building a tense map of every Cashin ruling transmitted to Earth. Cross-referencing each verb ending against the handful of confirmed provisional tense samples buried in the tribunal's own public archive of prior species contacts. By the second night, she stopped trusting the UN's official translation feed entirely and began retranslating from the raw transmission data herself. Because the feed had, whether by carelessness or design, flattened every provisional marker into the same neutral past tense English used for settled fact. Solis's discovery came a day after Annen's, and it was the quietest of the 3, and in the end the one that mattered most. Buried on page 311 of the indictment, in a case cited to support the claim that humanity's wars demonstrated species-level instability, was a ruling from the Cashin archive itself, 4,000 years old, concerning the tribunal's own homeworld. The case was nearly identical. A species with a violent history had been brought before this exact court, and the ruling, the actual precedent, not the summary Vantik's staff had extracted, had gone the other way. The court had ruled that a violent past, if the species demonstrated an active trajectory toward self-governance, was insufficient grounds for a deficiency finding. Vantik's own indictment had cited the case number correctly. It had cited the outcome incorrectly. Voss read Solis's finding twice, then went quiet in a way none of them had seen before. Because for the first time since the ship arrived, she understood they were not defending humanity from an alien court. They were about to catch that court lying about itself. There was a fourth discovery, smaller than the others, and Kwarteng almost dismissed it as irrelevant before Voss stopped him. Buried in the tribunal's own procedural code was a clause requiring that any species formally contesting a deficiency finding be granted standing to cross-examine the presiding adjudicator directly, in open session, on questions of evidentiary accuracy. No species in the archive's 11,000-year record had ever invoked it. Kwarteng suspected, and later confirmed, that this was because no species reviewed before humanity had ever finished reading the footnotes long enough to find the clause at all. They wrote a right into their own law, Kwarteng said, that assumed no one would ever be thorough enough to use it. The Cashin response to the formal request for the full unredacted archive was immediate, and it was not the request Vantik had wanted to receive. His communication arrived less than an hour after Kwarteng's team submitted it, and its tone had changed. The polished, unhurried condescension of the General Assembly speech was gone, replaced by something clipped and formal. Request acknowledged. Archive access constitutes a full evidentiary review, extending proceedings. Final ruling now scheduled for 72 hours from this transmission. Deficiency finding, if upheld, results in mandatory custodianship status. Sovereign governance suspended pending indefinite Cashin oversight. Voss read the message once out loud to the team. Then she said 72 hours is not a threat, it's a schedule. We asked for the archive, now we build the case. A second transmission followed within the hour, addressed not to Voss but to the UN Secretary-General, copied to every permanent member state. It restated the custodianship clause in full, translated this time without the softening the General Assembly speech had used. Sovereign governance, it said, would not be suspended gradually. It would be suspended at the moment the ruling was entered, effective immediately, with Cashin administrators authorized to assume oversight of orbital defense, resource allocation, and interstellar communication within 6 hours of the finding. It was not written as a punishment. It was written the way a filing deadline is written, indifferent to the size of what it decided. They worked in shifts. Kwarteng cross-referenced procedural requirements, building a formal motion under Cashin rules that no one at the tribunal had expected a newly contacted species to know existed. Anand rebuilt the mistranslated grammar of every prior ruling, line by line, until the provisional tense was undeniable and documented. Solis assembled the 4,000-year-old precedent into a formal citation, matched exactly to the format the Cashin court itself required for an evidentiary challenge. None of it was a weapon, all of it was a filing. The tribunal chamber on the 72nd hour was lit the way a hospital corridor is lit, evenly, without warmth. Vantik sat at the center of a curved bench. 16 jurists flanked him. Voss stood alone at a podium built for a taller species. Kwarteng and Anand sat behind her. Solis held the physical printout. She had refused to trust it to a data channel. Vantik opened with 11 minutes of formal procedure. He restated the deficiency finding as though nothing had changed. His delivery was unhurried. He had done this 412 times before. Nothing in his posture suggested this would be the 413th exception. He allowed himself one moment of genuine competence. Kwarteng invoked the cross-examination clause. Vantik did not object. He confirmed it immediately on the record because refusing his own court's rule would cost him more than granting it. It was the correct move. It was also the move that let Voss ask her first question under oath. Voss's response took just over 4 minutes. She cited the grammatical tense of every provisional ruling. She asked the tribunal to confirm on record whether a provisional finding could be enforced as final. 2 jurists conferred quietly in a dialect Anand's notes had never fully mapped. A long pause followed. The answer was no. She cited the disclosure requirement. She asked whether the full archive had been provided before the original finding. The answer again was no. Then Solis stepped forward. She placed the 4,000-year precedent on the bench directly in front of Vantik. Case number correct, outcome corrected. The ruling that had favored a violent species demonstrating active self-governance. She said nothing. She did not need to. A tribunal that prides itself on 11,000 years of consistent precedent cannot survive being shown, in its own chamber, the one case it misquoted. The silence that followed was the longest of the proceeding. One juror, older than the rest, spoke first. Not in Vantik's defense. He asked, in formal procedure, whether the tribunal wished to withdraw the finding rather than have it overturned on the record. Vantik did not answer for 4 full seconds. Then he said the one word that closed the case: withdrawn. The official transmission came within the hour, cold and procedural, confirming the deficiency finding's withdrawal and closing the review. It was not the transmission that mattered. Vantik's personal message arrived 6 hours later, addressed to Voss alone, unlisted in any official channel. There was a pause before he spoke, long enough that Voss thought the transmission had failed. "I have presided over 412 species reviews," he said. "None of them found the misquotation. I did not think a species 11,000 years younger than this court would read our own law more carefully than we did." Another pause. It was audacious. "I assumed a young species would argue with anger. You argued with our own book." Voss did not reply with a speech. She was already back at her desk when the message ended. Solis's 4,000-year precedent opened beside 3 more Cashin rulings Anand had flagged, each one built on a translation choice no one had checked twice. "If they've mistranslated one case," Voss said to no one in particular, "they've mistranslated others. And somewhere in 11,000 years of case law, there's a precedent that isn't about defending ourselves at all." She did not say what she meant by that at first. Anand asked her to clarify, and Voss only marked 3 more case numbers on the printout Solis had carried into the chamber. Cases the tribunal had cited against other species, long before humanity existed, in reviews no one on Earth had ever known to ask about. "Every species they've judged is still in that archive," Voss said. "We didn't just win an appeal, we found a library nobody else was ever allowed to read twice." Kwarteng looked at the 3 case numbers, then at Voss, then said nothing. Because he understood faster than the others that the 72 hours they had just survived were not the end of the work. They were the first footnote in a much longer filing. Solis began photographing the printout page by page because she had learned in 3 days not to trust anything about this case to a single copy. Outside, the recorded consensus remained in orbit. Its official status changed from adjudicating vessel to withdrawn pending appeal. A designation that meant nothing to the people watching the sky, and everything to the people who had just spent 3 days reading 11,000 years of somebody else's law more carefully than its authors ever had. Anand asked eventually whether any of it would matter to the tribunal's other subject species, the ones judged and filed away long before Earth had a written language of its own. Voss did not answer immediately. She was already cross-referencing the first of the 3 flagged cases against a Kashan statute governing appeals filed on behalf of a third party. A clause she suspected, correctly, that no species in 11,000 years had ever been thorough enough to invoke either. Not yet, she said, but it's on the docket now. He said, but it's on the docket now.